Thank you all, and welcome to the 10th session of the Made Summer web series. Today, we are very, very lucky to have Ralph Nader with us. He's SVP Head of Talent at IPG Mediabrands. And today, he's going to be talking about what's on all your minds, I'm sure, is how to get a job. But not only that, how to combine your interests and your passion and your skills to land your dream job. And Ralph just about lives and breathes this stuff. So we're very, very lucky to have him join us today. And yeah, so before I hand it over to Ralph, I just want to let you know that this will be recorded. So if you have to cut out early or you know someone that couldn't make this session, we will be recording it and posting it on our website, aef.com, early next week. And also, Ralph wants us to be as interactive as possible. So when you ask questions, you can do it in the chat box throughout the session, and we will try our best to address them as they come in. And that's about it. So Ralph, if you want to take it away, the stage is all yours.
All right. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone, or good evening or morning, depending on where you're logging in from. There's such a large group, and many of you coming from different schools and different places. So really happy to be here and sharing this time with you. Obviously, there's a lot of anxieties right now in the world, especially as it relates to employment. For those of you who were expecting to have internships this summer and rotations next year, or graduations and things like that, or even for those of you who are in the midst of changing careers. So the hope here is that we talk through some strategies that would hopefully be somewhat recession-proof. So things that you should be thinking about regardless of kind of your situation so that you can adapt and adjust. Again, just keep it as interactive as you can. This time is really for you, and I'm looking to you to guide the conversation and to help me focus on what's most important to you today, as these things will change. So just for starters, just to give you a little background on kind of why I'm speaking to you. Throughout my career in talent acquisition and recruitment, I've had the opportunity to recruit across a lot of different industries and a lot of different functions. As a result, it's really given me a good sort of well-rounded perspective on what is necessary across different walks of life, but also what are some of the common denominators, especially with early career, what I would refer to kind of throughout as career starters and for career changers. Note, you don't have to hold your questions till the end. You can go ahead and shoot them out, and I'll do my best to get to them as we go. With these common denominators, I really wanted to give individuals an opportunity to create their own strategy and to think through some of the stuff that we look through when we select candidates. I've developed this passion for early career and career changers because I feel like it's one of those areas where you can have such an impact in individuals' future by addressing it sort of early and often. So we'll jump right into it. Keep in mind that obviously some of this stuff was created and written pre-COVID, and we'll have to kind of alter the messaging a little bit. So please don't be shy to kind of stop me, and we'll tailor it. So this notion of understanding your passion and developing your career, it's a 5-step process, and I'll switch to the next slide, and it's a 5-step process that I refer to as the dream process, and I'll explain a little bit more sort of why I call it that. So please forgive the cheesiness of it for a minute. Very often when people start thinking about jobs and employment, the first thing they do is they slap together a resume and they start sending it out. And their job search strategy is really just that. It's a resume and a bunch of applications and hope for the best. And most often than not, we hear, I keep applying to these black holes of online databases and I'm not hearing back, and I'm not really sure if I'm moving in the right direction. What I'd like to suggest is that you don't start there. That in fact, the resume building and the resume sharing actually will address that in steps 3 and 4. But really starting at the very beginning, everything begins with you, especially as a career starter, you have an opportunity to determine your own path and determine your own future. You're not tied in to, you know, a lot of former experience or former circumstances that need to necessarily guide your future. So you have this opportunity to really start from anew. So let's start about this concept of dream big. Again, I know it sounds cheesy, but I want to try to kind of bring it down to reality a little bit for all of you. If you were to really have a conversation with yourself, and that conversation starts with, what am I really interested in and what am I passionate about? Not the conversation about what am I qualified to do, right? And I hope you understand sort of the nuance there, because for a career changer or a career starter, what do I have the experience to do? The answer is usually not much, because the nature of the situation you're in is that you're a career starter or changer. So you've not yet accumulated this 10 or 15 or 30-year portfolio of experience that should tell you what to do next. So it's really about thinking, what do I want to do? Who do I want to be? What am I interested in? And this concept of things that you're interested in versus kind of the day job that you have do not need to be mutually exclusive. And through this process that we'll talk about today, my hope is that you find creative ways to tie your passion and interests with the things that are going to be ultimately sort of paying the bills for you. So really start there. Start with a clear mind, really starting from the beginning and thinking about, if sky's the limit and I could be anybody I want to be and I could do anything I want to do, as crazy as it might sound today, still put it down on paper, because ultimately it comes from somewhere, right? And so one of the exercises, for example, that I've found useful to do this is, you know, when you're in a sort of relaxed state, right? Like you kind of get outside your own brain for a minute and kind of relax this notion of, what can I do? What should I do? What do my parents want me to do? What are my friends doing? What is my experience telling me I should be doing? If you can really just have a conversation with yourself and draw sort of a bullseye on a piece of paper, on a whiteboard, and start listing things on that bullseye that you have an interest in. Maybe it's dogs, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's accounting, maybe it's a major or minor that you had in school, maybe it's a career that you're interested in, maybe it's just a curiosity. Whatever it is, put them on that bullseye. Put the things that you're sort of least interested in towards the outside rings of that bullseye, and the things that you're most interested in towards the middle. Once you've had a chance to spend some time doing it, you don't have to do it all in one sitting, because very often these things will come to you sort of as you think about it later. Add them to the bullseye and then draw a circle kind of within the first few rings. And that should sort of tell you, what are the things that are most important to me? And then the exercise of sort of connecting the dots begins. And again, I think what you'll find is that your passion and your interests and your career can all actually be aligned. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that your next job will be a perfect alignment of everything you want in life, but as long as it gets you on that path and on the right path, you'll find yourself in sort of better shape. So again, because of we have sort of a short amount of time today, I'm going through some of these things relatively quickly, but I will pause for questions. So I'm going to pause now for the first set of questions around this kind of dream big concept.
Yes. Are you able to see the chat?
Yep, it just popped up. So so Alexis, yes. So beginning with your why. So it's interesting for those of you who are not familiar with this concept of beginning with why. Simon Sinek has a very famous and popular TED Talk about this concept of beginning with the why. And it's a concept that has made a lot of companies very successful, and it's absolutely a concept that you can apply here. It ultimately sort of drives at what motivates you. Why are you doing the things you want? Why are you seeking the things you want? And once you're clear about the why, then you start tackling the how and the what and all of the other things that come with it. Alejandro, for your question about what if you have multiple answers, you should. Honestly, you should have many answers to this, because I mean, I can tell you from my own experience I had one roommate early on in college who knew exactly what he wanted to do in life. And he knew, actually I knew two people like that. Both of them knew exactly what they wanted to do since they were like 5 years old. One of them wanted to be a pilot, the other wanted to be a doctor. And my pilot friend, he was my next door neighbor, by age 14 had his pilot's license, and he now flies commercial for Southwest, right? So like he knew what he wanted to do from the get-go. My doctor friend, he started his college program in pre-med, went to med school, followed that's what he wanted to do. They are the exception to the rule. The majority of people are like you and me. We don't know what we want to do. We didn't know necessarily what we wanted to do after college. College by design is supposed to expose you to a lot of things, but in my humble opinion, it doesn't always do a great job narrowing the focus by the time you graduate. And unfortunately and fortunately, many people use internships as a way of kind of knowing if this is the right career path. But the unfortunate part of that spectrum is if you don't have the opportunity to do an internship, many people do use their first job out of college as kind of their last internship, if you will. And it can work out really well if you are able to identify what you want to do quickly. It can also backfire because it could also pigeonhole you into a career that you don't necessarily want. And just by way of illustration, I did not know at all what I wanted to do when I started my career. And I remember graduating. I went to the University of Arizona, and I moved to New York right after graduation because my family was here. And I really had no clue what the future held. I wasn't a 4.0 student. I wasn't particularly kind of motivated at that time. The good news for me is that New York's one of those places where if you're not motivated, it'll kind of chew you up and spit you out. So I had no choice but to kind of light that fire, which was great. But then I found myself applying to hundreds of jobs. I went on, job boards, and I would just kind of mass apply and hope for the best, because I had no strategy. I had no goal. I had no real vision for what my future should look like. And I found myself going on some of the worst interviews I can remember. One that sticks out, I remember getting a call from a paper and office supply company that may as well have been Dunder Mifflin back then. And they said, "Hey, we have this manager job open, and your background looks great. Do you want to be our manager of marketing?" And I thought, man, I just lucked out. They said, "Come in for the interview, but block the whole day because we'll want you to meet with a lot of people." So I thought, wow, I'm going to come into this company. I'm going to have to meet with leadership. I need to prepare, whatever. I get there, and the interview was going door to door selling pencils with one of their salespeople. I very quickly identified that was not necessarily the job I wanted. But I did waste an entire day going door to door and convincing people that, that particular brand of pencils was the best. So without direction, you could find yourself losing your way quickly, but it also doesn't mean that you have to be married to one thing, because again, the sky's the limit right now for you. So if you are going to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different interests, that's totally fine, but do take the extra time to create a strategy around each of them, because if they are somewhat related or very related, one strategy could work across the board. But if they're actually very different, the strategy could alter. So be mindful that you're not doing one thing to actually try to accomplish something else. That's the only thing I would tell you. So have as many as you want, but do have a strategy for each if you're going to go that route. So moving on from Dream Big. So if you think of Dream Big as sort of the 30,000 foot plan and the no restriction, world's your oyster sort of perspective, the R from Dream is the research and plan. So at this stage, we're going to take your dream and we're going to ground it in reality, and we're going to start creating the path. This path is really about starting to select how you're going to spend your time and how you're going to allocate your time. Because the reality is, when you go through this process of mass applying, you're actually diluting your applications in a way that you're not submitting a great application to any one thing. You're essentially submitting a bunch of mediocre applications to a lot of things. Because if you think about it, there's only one of you going through that process. So there's only 100% of your time that you can spend. And so you want to make sure that whatever time you are allocating to your job search is spent in the right places. So to narrow down, back to Alejandro's point, if you have many, many answers, it's great to have, or many questions, that's great to have them up top. But now that we're talking about the kind of research and reality, start looking at what are your target industries, right? So if I could have any job in the world, is there an industry that I feel most passionate about? Maybe I love healthcare. Maybe I love finance. Maybe I love media and entertainment. But define it. Like, what does it mean, right? So when we say, I love media, well, media includes PR agencies, ad agencies, TV broadcasting, Netflix. All of that is within media, media buying and trading and selling and digital media, and those annoying banner ads that you get every time you open an app or whatever. All that falls under the media umbrella. But I would assume that you're not equally interested in all those things. So as you're thinking about your industries, start narrowing down, like, what's the industry that I want to be a part of? Within that industry, start looking at the companies. What are the companies that I'm interested in and why, right? Like, is it Nike's got great advertising? Does it mean I want to work there? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe their corporate values or don't align with what I want to do. Maybe their headquarters are nowhere where I want to live. For some of you, you might be industry agnostic, or you might be company agnostic, or you might really care about a company and not really care about an industry. Totally fine. You know, ultimately, at some point in your career, you'll hit sort of the kind of trifecta, or the jackpot, which would be you get everything that you want. But on your way there, you're okay having one of the three or one of the four, and then two of the three or two of the four, and then increasing that way. So start with industry, look at companies, and then start asking yourself, what's the function that I want to serve? So within that company and within that industry, what job do I want to have? And you don't necessarily need to boil it down to a truly specific job title, but you should at least be able to narrow it down to a function. Where this becomes sort of very important is, if you were to think about something that I hear a lot from entry-level candidates, especially when they're coming into the media world, it's, well, I'm interested in PR and advertising, or I'm interested in marketing and advertising. Well, that's great, but those are actually different functions. So some companies that you're talking to, they might find that impressive that you like both, because they're a small company and maybe their PR and marketing and advertising group is one person or one group that all works together. But for larger organizations, these are three completely different groups that often don't even sit in the same place. So if you were to present that way to that employer, they might look at you as being scattered, as opposed to actually knowing what you want to do. So think about the function, critically think about the function and how you'd like to grow along that path. And then you start looking at the roles. So it's sort of like, again, we're taking the 30,000-foot view and we're bringing it down to reality. So you've got the industry, you've got the company, you've got the function. Now what's the role that I'm going to play within that spectrum? So one of the cheat sheets that I'd give you to help narrow that gap is to actually create these target lists. List out your companies, ask yourself why I'm interested, list out your industries, why am I interested, list out the functions, list out the roles. For function and role, I'm going to give you another little sort of tip. Without limiting yourself to jobs that you're qualified for, go on a search. Use whatever website you're most comfortable navigating, whether it's LinkedIn or Indeed or any of the other aggregators out there. Look for jobs that you're actually not qualified for. Look for the most senior level positions within the functions or the companies that you're interested in. I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I'm not suggesting that you should apply to those jobs, because this is for research purposes only. But the reality is that almost every entry-level job description looks the same. I mean, about 75% of that job description is going to be the same, and then maybe 25% of it will be specific to something like a function. But for the most part, by and large, it's an entry-level position because it doesn't require a ton of experience. So there's not going to be a ton of experience to guide you on that job description. But when we start looking at like director, VP, senior VP, head of, chief of, manager of, then you start seeing job descriptions that actually list out true skill sets and qualifications and responsibilities that you will need to acquire throughout your career. So that's a great place to start, because what you can do is go on, and again, don't limit yourself to, oh, the company's in Seattle, but I live in New York, I'm not going to look at them. Who cares? You're not actually applying, right? So look at as many companies as you want, and pull up job descriptions. As you read through the job descriptions, anything that you're interested in or that sounds like something you'd like to spend your time doing, write it down, put it on the left side of your page. And anything that you see that you don't like, put it on the right side. And just put a little note on there, like what was the title, what was the function, and then kind of move on. When you do that over the course of 15, 20, 25, 30 job descriptions, what you're actually doing is drafting your dream job description. And once you have that, you can actually take that, and that becomes sort of your guiding light for the rest of your search process, because any job that you see, any posting that you see, any application that you put in, you look at your kind of dream job description and you ask yourself, does this job that I'm applying to and spending my time and energy and effort applying to, does it keep me in line? Does it put me online for that job, or does it take me away from it? And it also teaches you, like for me, for example, I was someone who, again, I didn't know what I wanted and I had a lot of interests. So my list on the left was really, really long. I mean, I would read these job descriptions and think to myself, oh, this sounds interesting. I'll put it on the list. But that didn't actually help me because I had too much on there. And I was like, I can't be everything to everyone. So what helped me the most was actually what I had on the right side of the page, which were the things that I didn't want to spend my time doing. So for me, it ended up being a process of elimination that led me to where I ended up, mixed with circumstances and a little bit of luck. That's really sort of what got me there. So I'll move to the next slide. And let me just, before we kind of get too far on this slide, I do want to address this question about the difference between function and role. So think of the function as the larger thing. So your function could be marketing. The roles within marketing could be very different. You could be a project manager on a marketing team. You could be a graphic designer on a marketing team. You could be a ad sales marketer. You could be a experiential marketer. You could be an event marketing person. You could be a partnership marketing person. There are going to be dozens, if not hundreds, of roles that exist within a specific function. So I say this and I draw that that distinction because when you interview, especially when you interview with larger companies, their expectations are that you're going to be more specific in what you want to do. And your ability to come into an interview and rather than saying, I'm interested in marketing, saying, I'm interested in marketing, but specifically, I'm interested in trade marketing because there's something about trade marketing that calls out to me, or I'm interested in B2B marketing, not necessarily B2C marketing. Just by virtue of making that very simple statement, you've just impressed your interviewer. Because, you know, one of the questions that inevitably somebody is going to ask today, so we'll get ahead of it, is how do you make yourself stand out in the crowd? That's how. It's by not having the same answer that the other 100 interviewees are going to have. Because think about it, most of the people you're graduating with now have similar interests. Like there weren't 500 majors at your school. There were, you know, maybe a dozen that most of the graduates gravitate to. So if you're answering that question by only indicating the function, at times you could actually be showing how little you've researched the company or your career path. Does that, I hope that answers your question. Along that path of kind of creating this kind of dream job description, one of the most significant things that anybody ever said to me, you know, I was doing a little bit of soul searching at what I like to kind of jokingly refer to as my quarter life crisis. This person said to me, Ralph, you're never more than 5 jobs away from your dream job, no matter what that dream job is. So you want to be an astronaut, you can get there in 5 steps. You want to be president of the United States, you can get there in 5 steps. In fact, someone we all know got there in 1 step. So the sky's the limit concept is real. Like it's not this sort of cheesy saying. It's if you do create a path for yourself, you could definitely get there. So part of it is actually starting with the end in mind, and you take your, you know, this dream job description that you created, and you find out, okay, if I want to spend my days doing this, who can I emulate? Go on LinkedIn, do a search. Who's got a background like the one that I eventually want to have down the road? And use that person or use their background or use a combination of multiple people to determine sort of what the end goal is. So if you start with the end in mind, where you see where it's written qualifications A through Z, those are all the things that you're going to have to accumulate throughout the course of your career to eventually be qualified for the dream job that you want. If you start there and then you just walk backwards to where you are today in step 1, the next job you apply to should give you 2, 3, 4, 5 things that put you on path for that dream job. And then you keep jumping to the next one. And the next one should give you a few more things. So if you think kind of rationally about how this process works, when you're up for a promotion or when you're looking to move jobs, usually you've already been doing some of that work in your current role. So there's always going to be an overlap between step 1 and step 2 and step 2 and step 3 and step 3 and step 4. The biggest nuance here is just make sure you're not just going sideways or going backwards. And the concept here doesn't necessarily mean that you always have to move up. It's not a hierarchical kind of scenario. And if any of you are familiar with Sheryl Sandberg's book, Leaning In, you know, she talks about this concept of the career jungle gym, not the career ladder. So your ability to move forward doesn't always mean that you have to move up. And I've had to do that a number of times in my career where I've identified, for example, a gap in my own professional skill set. And I had to take a lateral move to get that experience. So from a experience building and from a career pathing perspective, I was actually moving up, even though my title stayed lateral. So if you, and to going back to Alejandro's question, let's say you had 3 or 4 things that you identified, you can easily create 5 of these slides for each of the 5 things that you're interested in. But it always, to me, I found this to be very helpful because anytime I was in doubt about a job or something that was happening professionally or changes, I could always go back to this and say, am I still on track here? And if the answer was yes, it's okay to move forward. If the answer was no, it was kind of one of those, maybe I'll revisit later. And as you are developing your strategy, you always have to keep in mind that life circumstances will change, as obviously we're all seeing now with COVID, but your own personal life situations will change. And your ability to consider certain jobs or certain opportunities are very often tied in to that. So you have to allow for some flexibility. There is no blueprint that anyone can give you for how to get your dream job. And if anybody tells you that, they're lying to you, because there are way too many variables that will always be outside of your control. So the idea here is control the elements that you can control, allow for flexibility, but as long as your guiding light kind of remains where it should be, you'll always be driving towards the same path. So some of those things around life experiences, right? Let's say you're a recent graduate and you have a ton of student loans that you have to pay, and you do not have family support or independent wealth or whatever else. The financial component of your first job out of school becomes a critical element for you. So you may have to minimize some of the other things on your list of wants. It's sort of like, you know, Maslow's, the pyramid of needs. That is, professionally, it does change. So today, money is your most important thing. Maybe tomorrow it's not money, it's flexibility because you've got a child on the way, or you're taking care of a sick family member, and you just need more flexibility. Like you can't travel around the world for your job. You can't work, you know, 18 hours a day. So all those things will always change. And the minute you get comfortable, they will change again. So as great of a job as you do with this, just be mindful that it will change, allow for that change, and be flexible from that perspective. Any questions on that before I move on? All right, Jessica, I see your question. It's a longer question to answer, so let's come back to that. I'm hoping that some of the rest of the content will answer some of your questions within that, and whatever's left, just don't be shy, re-ask it, and we'll get to it just a little bit later. All right, so we've done the D, we've done the R, now we're on the E. So E is express yourself. So the express yourself portion of this is really about developing your profile, and your profile as a job seeker, whether you're a career starter or changer, it is the profile that you're putting out there. And that's where the resume comes in, right? So if you've noticed, we're now on step 3. So to my earlier point, I've not even mentioned your resume until just now. Whereas most individuals that I speak to, by step 3, they've already sent their resume, right? So that's the notion of, in my opinion, if you're not clear on step 1, which is what truly drives you, and you're not clear on step 2, which is how are you going to get it, how can you create a profile, which is a resume or your pitch, your elevator pitch, your digital footprint, like your LinkedIn profile or your online portfolio, or your activities. How can you do that effectively if you haven't answered question 1 and 2 to a degree that you can actually do that? So that's why it comes in step 3. And the 4 sort of biggest pillars on that, sorry for the jumping around, are the resume. And the reason the resume is so critically important is, look, it's just a piece of paper, right? And I'm never going to tell you, even though I've reviewed literally thousands of resumes in my career, that you can get a true sense of who a person is or how successful they're going to be or how successful they have been just by looking at a piece of paper, right? It's just not the way it works. But what you do look for in a resume is, 1, how relevant is this resume specifically for the job that I'm recruiting for, right? So I think, Jessica, to one of the elements in your question is sort of how do you apply into an industry? There's a difference between applying kind of a generic application, which is I'm just trying to get my foot in the door of this industry, but I really don't know what I want to do. Give me a shot and I'll test it out. Versus I know exactly what I want to do, or I think I know what I want to do, and I'm creating a resume and a story that matches that goal specifically. So your resume, think of it as, it needs to be a standalone document. One of the biggest mistakes that I see with resumes is individuals who say, yeah, it's not on my resume, or it's not super clear, but I'll clarify it in the cover letter, or I'll clarify it in the interview. You're never going to get to the interview if your resume didn't get my attention. So you'll actually never have that opportunity if your resume isn't a standalone document. And what I mean by standalone is it needs to tell the story that you want to tell without other supporting documents that I will likely not take the time to open up. And I do apologize if it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but the reality is, as recruiters, most recruiters rarely spend more than 10 seconds skimming a resume initially. If the information that we can glean from the resume in the first, literally the first 3 to 7 seconds are enough to capture my attention, I might read some more and then dig in a little bit more. But if you don't catch me right away, I'm moving on to the next one. So it has to be set up in a sort of aesthetically pleasing way that allows for the flow that you have in mind to be followed in a way that is easy for your reader. So, if it's super content heavy, you're playing with your margins and somebody told you somewhere, somehow, that your resume should be 1 page and that's what you're striving to do. If it's too content heavy, we're going to lose what you're actually trying to tell us very quickly. You're actually better off by more relevant content than more quantity of content. So one of the tips and tricks I can offer you to do that is take sort of a draft resume. And as you read job descriptions, it'll likely sort of trigger some thoughts of, oh, I did something like that, or I took a class that touched that, or oh, I had a project in that. Start putting all of those things on your resume, every single thing, right? Don't limit yourself by anything, and create a really long brainstorm resume. Again, just like the previous research thing we talked about, you're not submitting this, so it doesn't have to necessarily look pretty, so don't worry about formatting. But it's a brainstorm. It's a way for you to capture every single thing you've ever done that is relevant to your professional life. You then find a job that you want to apply to. You take that job description, you take your brainstorm resume, and you start removing content from the massive resume that doesn't directly apply to that job or that you don't think advances the story that you're trying to tell. And you shrink it back down to a 1-pager. Now your 1-pager is a 1 page of truly relevant information as it relates to that specific job, right? So that takes a lot of the guesswork out of your hands and really let the job description guide what you include. And I'm not suggesting you start kind of removing things that are important to you. My only thing here is what is important to you may not be the most important thing to the person reviewing your resume, and they're actually telling you what the most important thing is to them through the job description. So when you see these job descriptions, start training your brain in reading them as they're usually all set up in a very similar format, by the way. You kind of get the, about us, which is kind of the company summary. Then you get the responsibility and about the role kind of a thing. And then you get your requirements. when you start looking at the responsibilities and the requirements, train your brain to start thinking in terms of must-haves and nice-to-haves. And the must-haves are really what we're looking for. So anything where you see required or must, literally it says must have experience in this, those are usually the things that are non-negotiable. And the reason they're non-negotiable very often is because if we start looking at candidates who don't have that experience, then we have to open it to everyone. So very often we have to sort of lock ourselves into a certain basic standard of requirements that we abide by. And those are your must-haves. The reason I draw this distinction is that very often I hear people say to me, but look at the job description. I have almost everything they ask for. Yeah, but you have almost all of their nice to haves, but you don't actually have their must haves. So they're not going to consider you, or they might not consider you as easily. So think of that as you're drafting your resume. Think of that as you're drafting the way you're going to tell your story. Again, resume should be really simple, easy to follow, relevant to the job you want. Other questions we usually get around resumes are like, what do you feel about the objective line? Objective line, use your judgment, right? Like if let's say you graduated with a degree in marketing and you did 2 internships in marketing and you're applying for a job in marketing, you don't really need to connect the dots for me. Like, I got it. You're applying for a job in marketing because you're a marketing background. Like, fine, you can omit the objective. But if you're someone who maybe did a internship in finance or doesn't have an internship or doesn't have experience in the role that you're applying to, the objective line is a good way for you to leverage the things that you feel are relevant to that job. So, leveraging my negotiation skills, or like my experience from the debate team to a sales career, right? Like, you've connected the dots for me in terms of I get why you're applying for a sales job. You like talking to people, you like negotiating, you like closing deals. Thank you for the objective line. That was useful. But remember, the objective line takes precious and valuable real estate on your resume. So if it's not serving a purpose, omit. The other question we get a lot is around the cover letter. Unless you're applying for an editorial job or a communications job, or it's actually required as part of the application, it's almost useless. So sorry to all of you who spent hours on your cover letter, but the reality is recruiters do not look at the cover letter first. We always look at the resume first, and then if we have questions, we go to the cover letter, or we use the cover letter as a writing sample if you're going into a job that requires you to be a writer. Reason for that is actually quite simple. I've yet to read in my career a cover letter that says, "To whom it may concern, please give me a chance at your company. I suck at life. I'm always late. I'm tough to work with. I don't learn easily, and I'm generally unpleasant, but hire me anyways." I've yet to see one of those. Almost every single cover letter I see is, "I'm awesome, I'm great, and I'm a perfect fit for your organization." All right, cool. Doesn't tell me anything. As far as the cover letter, if it's not required, very often, and Jessica, to answer your question, if you're applying via email, the body of the email can actually serve as your cover letter. If you are including a cover letter, and you're welcome to do it, I'm not suggesting don't do it, but you just do not rely on it to get you to the next level, because the resume is much more important. And if you are going to include a cover letter, keep it simple. Anything more than 3 paragraphs, you're likely going to lose your reader's attention. And you don't need to use the cover letter to just reinforce what you just wrote in your resume. You should actually use the cover letter to address other things that maybe aren't on your resume. So again, I'm not suggesting like don't do them. Read the instructions of wherever you're applying to, because they might be required. And if they are required, you're going to have to do it. But again, if you have only a certain amount of time to spend the bulk of your time on your resume, not on your cover letter. Your pitch is your story. This is the story that you're telling people. This is the message that you want them to walk away with. And as a career seeker, or again, starter or changer, you want that message to really be in line with your resume, with the jobs you're applying to, and with everything else. This becomes more critically important when you start networking, which is another thing that I unfortunately see too often, is that people have this knee-jerk reaction of, one, they create the resume, then they start reaching out to everybody that they know to get introductions, or they start going to these events, but they don't have their story ready to go yet. So they meet someone who could eventually have an impact in their life, but they're not telling their story well enough for that person to walk away and feel, man, I need to hire them, or I know exactly what to do with them. So one way to set up your pitch that is, I find to be effective, is, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And why does this fit in your plan, right? So if you think of your story as, you know, my dream is to be the chief marketing officer at Pepsi. My background is in marketing, and actually I had focused in finance because I thought that's what I wanted to do, and I just recently changed majors, so I'm still gaining the experience I need in marketing. But this is where I was, this is where I'm going, and this role that you have open right now really fits where I'm heading, and I feel like I can contribute to it. That's where I think it really helps to have that pitch, and the story you're telling on your resume and the story you're telling in your pitch should also match your digital footprint. So your digital footprint is what is available about you out there on the web, and you have to be very, very careful with that. Most of the studies that we see, over 70% of the data that employers find online about candidates actually turns them off to that candidate and doesn't turn them on to the candidate. It's a tricky statement for me to make, because as an HR professional, we are trained to not allow biases and to not allow other elements to come into our inclusion criteria in terms of who we're going to move forward. The same is not true of hiring managers. So if you think about it, again, this is a human sort of a thing, right? So think about human nature. I talk to you, I'm your recruiter. I talk to you about something and I say, great, you're moving to the next rounds. Now you're going to interview with so-and-so. We book the interview for you. Your name pops up on that person's calendar. They're going to open your resume because it's usually there, but they might actually Google you. They might look you up on LinkedIn. They might see if they can find something. So be mindful of what information is out there and be mindful of how it's impacting your ability to tell the story. I used to see that more often when I was, so before IPG Mediabrands. So for those of you who don't know, Mediabrands is a holding company within IPG Global, which has like 7 to 12 different media buying and digital agencies. So before kind of going into the ad world, I was more on sort of the broadcast media side. I started with NBC Universal, then MTV Networks, and then went over to News Corp, and then moved over to IPG last year. I used to see that a lot, especially when I was with NBC and MTV, because the brands themselves, they're sexy brands. So they attract a lot of junior talent. And I remember a situation where we actually did not move forward with an applicant because their digital footprint didn't match. She had a great research and insights resume. I mean, it looked great. She was fairly junior, a couple of years out of school, but her data experience was actually really, really good. I moved her forward because, again, based on the resume, based on the qualification, she looked great. But the day before her interview, the hiring manager called me and said, hey, Ralph, did you look at her LinkedIn profile? And I said, no, I've got her resume. I didn't even open it up. He said, open it up. And I did. And her LinkedIn profile, and this was a research role based in New York, her LinkedIn profile essentially said in big, bold letters, aspiring singer looking to move to LA. That created such a disconnect between what was on paper and what was on the digital side for the hiring manager that they actually couldn't move forward, because in their head, they were like, so what if she's great? We can hire her and a day later, somebody gives her a gig in LA, she's gonna leave us. So that created this sense of this person being a flight risk. And to this day, I don't know if she ever moved to LA. But that's where you have to be mindful. So, and I want to be very careful here that I'm not suggesting that you censor yourself, right? This isn't about censorship. It isn't about don't be yourself. It's about just being mindful that as a career seeker, as a job seeker, that is your persona. It is a persona of a job seeker. And your best way to get there is to kind of, play within sort of those roles. The activity side of it is more about putting your money where your mouth is. A lot of people, and again, this is something I experienced more on the media side, they would come into these entry-level like admin jobs or marketing roles or PR jobs, but really their passion was to be a producer or a content creator. And they thought, well, if I get my foot in the door at Viacom or MTV Networks, because Viacom was, MTV, Nickelodeon, Comedy Central, and all those brands were under our team. We had a lot of people who came in and they were aspiring writers, but they would get these jobs sort of entry level and hoping that they would eventually be qualified enough to be a producer. But they will never be, because if you're going along the path of like research and insights or marketing and data or something else, you're not actually building skill sets that you need to be a great producer. So the point here is you can always find activities to engage in outside of your day job, so that when you tell an employer, yeah, I don't have experience in this, but I have an interest. Well, how do you know that you have an interest if you've never done anything with it? And it doesn't have to be professional. It can be a project you worked on. It could be a nonprofit that you volunteered with. It could just be a class that you took that spoke to you, but be ready to address some of those things. I'll pause real quick because I know we can spend an entire hour on resumes, but any quick sort of hitting questions on resumes and some of what we just discussed?
And Ralph, I just want to jump in here. You're at the, you have 15 minutes left. It's 3:45, just so you know.
Okay. Okay, just formats. So format on resume doesn't matter much, honestly. Like I don't look at it and say, oh, it's pretty or it's not pretty. As long as it's aesthetically pleasing enough that I can follow the flow, it's good. It's more about the content than the setup. What I will say though is if you are applying for creative type jobs, it behooves you to have a more creative resume, but not creative to the point where I can't read it. And no joke, this actually has happened to me. I had a resume submitted to me once, fantastic background, but she used a font that was so creative that I could not read her email or phone number, and we couldn't reach out to her. So just be mindful of that. I'm going to try to breeze through some of the stuff because I do want to leave enough time for questions too. So acting wisely is really the notion of, okay, now that you have all these elements, you started at level 1 with understanding yourself. You went to level 2 with your strategy and research and planning. You went to 3 with creating your kind of your quote unquote image and the messaging. 4 is really jumping in and putting them all together and starting the application process. So your basic application process, you're networking, you're applying, you're interviewing. Again, be careful to not start this too early, because if somebody cracks the door open for you, but you're not ready to walk through it with a good resume, a good story to tell, and a good digital footprint, you might lose that opportunity. So just be mindful of that. One thing I want to just spend a little bit of time on in this section is how COVID has affected this process. Interviews have changed. Right? You're not, for the most part, going in for in-person interviews, especially if you're in major metropolitan areas. And I will acknowledge that there's a lot of people on this call who are not in New York. And in some of your cities, life has begun to sort of be normalized again. Some of my friends in Dallas, their kids are back in school and daycare, whereas here for us in New York, there is no indication of when schools will reopen. So it's affecting different markets in different ways, but from a job perspective, the economy took a nosedive in March. Just for us at IPG, at Mediabrands specifically, on March 15th, 13, 14, 15, 16, so Monday the 16th, I had 286 positions that were open on my team. 3 weeks later, we had 0. We went from 286 to 0. Almost overnight. We also, in that time period, canceled our residency program for the summer, which was our internship program for the summer. So many of you on this call fell victim to the economy hitting us the way it did. It's starting to bounce back. It's a slow bounce back, and it's a bounce back that we can't predict because we're very much at a mercy of a virus that no one can predict. So if the thing goes away and we don't have a second wave in the fall and life goes back to normal, there was no real reason economically why we should have had a recession other than the virus. I mean, there was indicators, and we are, recessions are cyclical. So if you look at your career and the timing of when you're trying to start your career, do be mindful of where you are in the cycle, because very often the opportunities available to you will be in direct correlation with the unemployment rate. So unemployment being very high, obviously less opportunities, much more specialized skill sets being looked at. unemployment being low, much more opportunities. Usually, in fact, when we crashed on March 15th or 16th, we were in a candidates market. We had actually more jobs than we had qualified candidates to take the jobs. And now it's flipped completely 180. So be ready to interview in this sort of new mindset now. Your video interview or your phone interview is just as important as what your in-person interview used to be. So give it the same care, give it the same attention, be available, make sure your background isn't distracting to you or to your interviewer. Make sure you've got a good connection, make sure you're prepared to have a backup plan. So maybe when the interview begins, if you haven't done so already, shoot them an IM in the chat box, or just let them know, hey, in case we disconnect, here's my phone number, just write it down. If we have an issue, just call me, I'm here, I'm ready to go. Be mindful of all that. And to the question that just came up, how picky can you really be? A great question. It really depends what you're seeking. 2 months ago, 3 months ago, you could be relatively picky and you could expect more. Now, not so much. There's just not as much available. So that's where step 2 becomes really important for someone like you who just asked a question, because the opportunities that you may no longer have the choice to pick, then you get to ask yourself, do they fit my plan or do they not? And even if they indirectly keep you on path, it's probably okay, even though it's maybe not your first pick. Does that make sense? So moving on from that, the last piece is moving forward. So that's just a notion really, and I'm just gonna breeze through this, that you're always thinking ahead. Even when you do land a position or get an offer, you don't rest on your laurels at that point. You really think about, okay, now I'm at step 2, how do I start gearing myself up for step 3? And there's always opportunities to learn and grow in order to lead to your success. One of the biggest turnoffs during an interview is when you say to someone, or you ask the question, what's the reason you're looking for a new job? And they say to you, well, because I've hit a ceiling, I can't learn or grow anymore in my position. It's a cop-out question. And it usually signifies to your recruiter or your interviewer that there's an issue. In the world of HR, the rule of the rule of thumb is where there's smoke, there's fire. And when you hear something like "I can't grow," it sort of leads you to believe that there might be smoke there, because in almost all circumstances, if you're creative enough and you're motivated enough, there is a way to grow. And one of this sort of great example that somebody brought to my attention recently, especially as you know, right now with everything that's happened in the last few weeks, there's been such an emphasis on diversity and inclusion and hiring practices and things of that nature. And your ability to make the best out of your situation does translate into your potential aptitude for a job. I saw this story recently. I think his name is Ronnie Coleman. There's a Netflix documentary about him. He's a weightlifter. And he got into weightlifting because he was in college and was an econ major, was doing fine. His accounting professor realized that he had a special skill and gift for accounting. He was acing all of his exams and it seemed to come easy to him. So he said to him, switch your major, go to accounting. He said, all right, I'll do it. That's a pretty high paying job straight out of school and I need the money. Fantastic. He graduated, couldn't get a job. And, this was a number of years ago, but, fell victim to a lot of the unconscious and conscious biases that were going on. He's an African-American male and faced some of those challenges getting in. So he couldn't get into corporate America, needed the money and needed to eat, and literally needed to eat. So he got a job at Domino's, figured I need a job, I need income, and I need to eat. So here I am, I got pizza all day long. After about a year, he says, in the documentary, he says, I got sick of eating pizza and realized that there was a Burger King across the street. So I picked up the phone and called the guys at Burger King. Hey, are you guys sick of eating burgers? Because we're sick of eating pizza. You want to trade? And they started working out sort of bartering and trading process. And then a few months later, KFC opened up on the corner. And then Taco Bell opened up. And next thing you know, he had created this sort of like food exchange program, with only what he had at his disposal. So when you think of a scenario like this and you look at how little opportunities this individual had and still found a way to make it work for him, that's why the answer of I couldn't figure out a way to grow or learn becomes a really tricky thing to answer. Now, in his case, he ended up going on to becoming Mr. Olympia like 9 times and now being a multimillionaire. In your case, it might translate differently. It might translate to just telling the story a little bit differently. So I'm going to wrap up here. This type of presentation and the content in this presentation, we could talk about it literally for like 4 hours. But I do want to give enough time, and I don't mind going over a little bit if there are other questions that we can address, and really just open up the floor. Recommendation about time spending network and applying. It's tough to tell you how much time you should spend applying versus networking versus anything else. If you happen to know exactly what you want to do, networking does help, because the more people you know, the more opportunities are going to be created for you. And one of the common misconceptions with referrals and kind of this process of networking is a lot of people will tell you it's about kind of who you know, and usually that implies you know someone in a senior position or who has a lot of influence. It actually doesn't work out that way. Most often you'll find that you were given opportunities by people you really didn't expect. And it's through networking and widening your network that those opportunities will present themselves. So use your judgment there. As long as you have the story ready to go and your background's ready to go, then I think it should work. Maintaining relationships and networking, especially with recruiters who are dealing with a lot. So recruiters are always dealing with a lot. It's recruiting is one of those high volume, thankless jobs almost all the time. And it's rare that you'll find a recruiter that says, hey, I just had 3 extra hours today to respond to every single person who hit me up on LinkedIn today. So what you can do to help yourself is be specific as to why you're reaching out. Be specific in terms of, is there a follow-up item, right? So distinction between, this actually literally happened today. I got a note on LinkedIn from someone I didn't know, who was not referred to me by anyone I knew. So this is totally a cold call, if you will. And this person said, hey, I'm looking for a job and I'm interested to know what IPG has to offer. Dude, I'm not your college counselor. I don't know what you want. We're a $10 billion company. You're asking me to do all this work. I don't have the bandwidth or the time to do that for you. But at the same time, somebody else sent me a note that said, hey, I noticed you're in talent acquisition at Mediabrands. I just applied to this job. Here's the requisition number. I'm also attaching my resume here. I'd love to talk to someone about it, and please let me know if there are any next steps. I immediately took that and forwarded that to the appropriate recruiter so that they can reach out to this person. I didn't even need to open her resume, quite frankly, because the way she followed up felt, that's the way you want to do it, right? Like, there's an action item for me to do here. And you already did your work. You've already identified what you wanted to do. You already took the time to apply online. Now you're just kind of stacking the deck in your favor. So I hope that answers the question, but do keep in touch, because they will forget you. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just that when you're dealing with, I mean, just when I was at NBC, there was a year that I was there that I was supporting Bravo, Oxygen, and Sprout as networks. And back then, this was right when like Real Housewives and Top Chef and some of those shows were at the height of their popularity. I was getting 8,000 applicants a month just for Bravo. There's no way I can keep track of everyone. So you can follow up and you can follow, but be appropriate. So the guiding principle that I use, as appropriate or inappropriate as you may find it, when it comes to the job search, it's a little bit like dating. If it feels inappropriate in a dating environment, it's probably inappropriate in a job search environment. So think of, your first interview as your first date, or think your resume as your like online dating profile, right? Like, you want to show enough that somebody's going to show interest, but you're not necessarily telling your whole life story, right, in that online profile. And then when you get to the first interview, it is like a first date. It's enough to just, okay, do you match your profile? Do you look like your picture, right? Like, kind of connecting the easy dots, and then creating a scenario where they're going to want to invite you on a second interview or a second date. And if you're thinking about following up, it's the same principle, right? Like, you had a great date with someone, you follow up the next day, you don't hear back. Okay, what do? Do you start following up every day and you become that really annoying stalker-like human? Or do you use the same judgment? Say, okay, maybe they missed it. I'll follow up in 3, 4, 5 days. If they don't respond, maybe I'll follow up one more time or see if there's another way. Maybe they're not getting the email. But then beyond that, like, kind of get the message, right? So if it feels weird, if you're applying that to a dating scenario, it's likely going to be weird in that kind of scenario as well. Is there a benefit to paying for classes, certifications when a job? Yes, absolutely. There is benefit to continuing to upskill yourself. One thing I would advise in terms of upskilling, be clear about what your intentions are, because sometimes upskilling is not about necessarily choosing a discipline that you're passionate about. It might be about choosing a discipline that gets you to your goal more efficiently. So an example that I've used in my own career, there was a time a number of years ago where data analytics was exploding onto the scene. Everybody was talking about data and big data and data visualization and data engineering and all the cool things we can do with data. Most recruiters hated recruiting for data because the people you talk to who are kind of your data geeks are, generally speaking, kind of less extroverted. They're more introverted. They're a little more awkward. They're not your typical like great interview. But I thought to myself, there's an opportunity for me for growth here. I like recruiting for data. I'm a data geek myself. And I asked my employer at the time, would you pay for me to go to NYU this summer and take a class on data analytics? Because I'd like to build out a data analytics recruiting pod in the fall, specializing in that, knowing that that's the way of the future. They accepted, they paid for it, came back, opened up and created that pod. And that's what got me to the next level in my career. And it wasn't necessarily that I was passionate about data, is that I saw it as an opportunity. I did the same thing when I was with NBC. When I joined, I was supporting NBC News and recruiting very much like traditional, producers, communications, things like that. But then I saw, okay, this was the time when like the digital world was really exploding. And when I saw that writing on the wall, I started getting much more involved with digital. And then I became essentially the first digital focused recruiter that Viacom hired out of NBC, because there was an opportunity. So if you think about classes or upskilling yourself, think of like, okay, what's your interest and what's the goal that you're driving towards? But think practically, given this economy, what is going to get me there faster? And it's usually, without kind of generalizing, but it's usually the least sexy discipline, but that's the most in demand. That's where you should kind of start, because then that'll make your value skyrocket. What do I think about should be the percentage of my matching skills compared to job post? Good question. This goes back to our must-haves versus nice-to-haves. If it's the nice-to-haves, you should have at least 75%. If it's the must-haves, whatever you want. Doesn't really matter. Most of the nice-to-haves you're going to see are like collaborator, great creative thinker, things of that nature. Whereas the must-haves, it's a little bit more important. Many companies are moving away, especially at the early career and entry level, from kind of truly qualifications-based sort of interviews, because again, you don't have a ton of qualifications coming in. So you might see a surge in online testing and one-way video interviews to use as filters. So I don't have to make the call if you have the skill set, but I've already determined that you need to have a certain basic knowledge of Excel, for example, or math reasoning or logic. And so I might call you and say, hey, your resume is great, but you need to take this assessment before we can move forward. And if you don't get a 70 or above or 60 or above or whatever it is, you won't be considered for the role. So expect that, because there is a resurgence in that, especially as it ties into diversity and inclusion, because the tests allow for recruiting teams to completely remove the human bias from the selection process. So be prepared for that. Be prepared for an evolving landscape, especially as a result of COVID. We don't know when we're going to reopen in New York. We're already considering, what do virtual internships look like for us if we're going to roll something out? Are we going to be able to do it? How do we pay people? There's so many things, and no one has the answer right now. So anything I tell you about the future as it relates to COVID might change tomorrow morning. So just keep your ear to the ground, be ready to kind of roll with the punches, and things will get brighter. Your future just got delayed a little bit. And for those of you who are right there on the cusp of starting your internship and starting your professional life, my heart goes out to you, because I cannot imagine the stress and anxiety that you must have been feeling for the last 3 months. For some of you, not even knowing if you'd walk or you'd be able to graduate, or how it impacted your grades. And I'm truly sorry that you guys had to go through this. But it will get better. This is a phase like anything else. We hit that when the stock market crashed, when real estate crashed. We hit that after 9/11. Again, it's cyclical. This isn't the first time it happens. It will bounce back. The crucial element will be for you not to atrophy during that time. Like, don't sit around and just think, well, there's no opportunity, so I'm just going to sit and wait. Be creative. Think of the Ronnie Coleman story, like developing those partnerships between, Burger King and Pizza Hut and Domino's and whatever. Think about what you can be doing. In fact, we just hired someone, and I remember the recruiter asked her, you graduated, obviously your graduation was all screwed up, your internship was all screwed up. What have you been doing? And she said, well, I had all this time in my hands and I was able to complete my courses. And so my friend and I just started this nonprofit to help others during COVID. And we started delivering meals to people who couldn't leave the house because they were high risk. That has absolutely nothing to do with the career that she wants, but it was able to demonstrate a sense of just gumption, right? That made us feel really good about bringing this person on board, because we figured, even if you don't know how to do something, you're somebody who's going to figure it out and ask the right questions. So, if you think in that mindset, you can always prepare yourself for what comes next. I know we're over on time. Anything else? Oh, good. Thanks, Anna or Anna, for the feedback. And also know that with your interviews, especially for those of you who will be interviewing soon, the virtual interviews are awkward for your interviewer too. Many of them have never done them, or they don't know how to do them. So if you get a weird feeling, it's not because you're doing poorly. It might just be because they're feeling really weird about interviewing you. And so don't take that too personally. Trying to think if there's anything to tackle. Is there anything else that anybody wants to talk about?
Hi, my name's Alexis. I just wanted to hop on verbally, but I have a question about whenever you're through the whole process and you're kind of at that end point and you've already reached out to all of these people you've interviewed and you're maybe thinking of taking on that one opportunity, but then more come and there's more offers. What is the best way to kind of softly either deny or kind of reroute to where you're not losing that connection, but you're obviously going to another opportunity?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in a good economy, many of you are faced with those decisions, especially when there's more jobs and there are qualified candidates. Remember that taking an interview and going through an interview process and even receiving an offer, it's not like your college decision, like early decision, and it's binding, right? You're not tied into it. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you accept an offer and the day before you start, you call them and you say, nope, sorry, I'm not going. But I think if you do not take yourself out of the running until you get the offer. Because remember, your goal is your resume gets you the interview gets you the offer. Once you get the offer, then you get to decide, because too often, if you let that mindset kind of creep up too early in the process, you'll unconsciously sort of rule yourself out and you won't even get the offer. So you won't ever be given that choice. So my advice to you is be clear about what's most important to you. Be clear about what feels real, because, a lot of recruiters, and I hate to say this because I'm a recruiter by trade, but there are a lot more bad recruiters out there than there are good recruiters. And they will sell you on a position, right? They will tell you what you kind of want to hear so that you get to the end of the process. Start training yourself on what's important to me, right? Are company values and culture more important than the paycheck? The ability for growth, what does that look like? What's the career path for someone like me? What's the expectation? And you want to ask all those questions in a way that's productive, constructive, and educational for you, but not in a way that you sound like I'm ready to be promoted to VP. I've only been here for 3 months, right? So it's that mindset. And actually, it just made me think of something. Also, keep in mind that most of you on this call are millennials, and there is a stigma that comes with being a millennial. Like it or not, there is a stigma, and you have to just be aware of it. For a very long time, the largest group of interviewers and hiring managers in the US were baby boomers, while the largest group of incoming interviewees were millennials. You guys speak different languages. That's just the reality of it. What to you feels like an efficient way of leveraging technology so that you can leave at 4 instead of 7, to a baby boomer looks like you're lazy, right? So you've got to be mindful of the situation you're walking into and who your audience is, so that you can ask those questions in a way that you're addressing that potential sort of lens that they're looking at you with. And I think asking about the career path and what does that look like, and just in terms of managing my own expectations and career, when do you see people moving up to the next level, you know, things like that, totally legit. And hopefully that helps you make the decision.
Great, thank you.
I had a question.
Shoot.
I sort of kind of hopped on the tail end, so forgive me if you already covered this. But as a recruiter, I heard from another recruiter, how often do you look at a potential employee's LinkedIn? Like, not as far as what did they put on their LinkedIn as far as their accomplishments and education went, but how their engagement is. Because that recruiter in particular was saying, like, they wanted to see where they engaged in the industry. Do they know what's going on? Are they part of the conversation?
Yeah, so your question actually goes back to the slide that we had kind of around the 4 pillars about expressing yourself, and that pillar of activity falls in that, where if you're someone who doesn't necessarily have a ton of experience in a particular function or realm or job, recruiters will look at what have you done peripherally to continue to grow in that field. And you know, if you're applying for like a digital marketing job or a social media job or something that's relevant to the social platforms like LinkedIn, they may want to see your engagement, right? Like, so often we hear, oh, I'm great at social media. Well, why? You have a Facebook account like everybody does. Like, does that make you great at social media? No. But your engagement level might tell the recruiter a story. So how often do we look? I think you have to operate with the assumption that not just the recruiter, but the hiring managers and the hiring team will stalk you before you start. And so just be mindful of what's out there. And the most important thing to me is not necessarily your engagement, but again, that's more role specific, right? The most important thing to me is that your digital profile, your resume, and what you told me and your activities all match, right? They're all sort of function of each other, but because you start seeing the discrepancies when someone is saying, I love marketing on their LinkedIn, and then you get them on the phone and they're like, I'm really passionate about helping animals. And you're like, oh, okay. Are you trying to do both? Like, are you trying to do marketing at the like ASPCA, or are you just confused about life? Like, that's when you're going to get the discrepancy. So, and for everybody else on the call, you can ask the same question to 100 recruiters and you'll get 100 different answers. Again, there is no blueprint to how you do this. You have to sort of take everybody's advice, see how it applies to you in your specific circumstances, and wash everything with common sense. You know, because that's what's going to be kind of that's going to guide you. What else?
Ralph, I want to be respectful of your time. I don't know if I know you had an engagement after this. It's 4:15, so I don't know if you want to cut it off or you want to take one more question.
I'm good. I could do one more if somebody wants to throw something out there. Just go ahead and.
There's a few more in the chat.
You know what? Let me actually. That is a. Oops! I lost my screen. I don't know what you guys are.
Do you want me to read one out? Would that be helpful?
So the question was around when to apply, if I'm not mistaken. And
yes.
We do get this question a lot. Don't apply too early. So it's another misconception out there, especially as you get into like second semester, senior year, or right before graduation. If any of your friends have gotten jobs, you're like, oh my God, am I a failure? I don't have a job yet. The reality, just so you guys know, this is perception versus reality. The perception when you're going through it is that everybody has jobs but you. The reality is it's usually less than 11% of about to graduate undergrads have a job lined up. And most of those jobs that are lined up are within legal, finance, healthcare, or with an employer that you interned that offered you a job after your internship. The majority of you will graduate without a job, and that is not because you're a failure. It's because that's what most of us did. The challenge that you have when you're applying, think of a few things. One, if a job is posted in February, it's usually for an immediate start, right? Like one of the questions that we get a lot is, when are you looking to fill the position? Well, if you ask the hiring manager, the answer is going to be yesterday, right? So if you're applying for a job in February, but you don't graduate till May, and then you're not moving to the area until June, I'm not even going to look at you because I know I can fill that job within 4 weeks, and I need to fill it within 4 weeks, right? So use your judgment and common sense on that one. So, I usually say if you're graduating in May and you're already in the market that you're applying in, meaning that you can go on interviews without traveling, and now it's not so much of an issue because it's virtual, but when that shifts again, February, March, April, totally fine. If you're not in the market that you're in and you would need to make special accommodations to interview, then you'll probably want to wait till about a month before you can actually start interviewing. So, and go to as many career fairs, whatever they look like this fall. That's going to be really interesting because we're already talking to colleges about what their virtual career fairs would look like. But usually the fall career fairs, more so than the spring, will include the majority of the employers who do offer jobs while you're in your senior year. In my last role, we had a very robust sales development program, and we used to extend offers by Thanksgiving of your senior year for you to start after graduation. So that'll help you as well.
Okay. Well, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Ralph. I know everyone enjoyed it just by the comments in the chat box. It was incredibly informative. If any of you missed a portion of this, it will be recorded and posted on our site. I know a lot of you will want to go back and review a lot of what Ralph said, so definitely check it out. I'm actually going to pop in the chat here the link. And also, a lot of you are new faces, so feel free to visit our site. We have a lot of other resources for you all to participate in this summer. They're open and accessible to everyone, so go to that link that I just posted in the chat, check out our other resources, and don't forget to register for our session next week. We have Val DeFibo. She's the CEO of Deutsch New York. So if you ever wanted to hear directly from a CEO how she got to that position, and of course, ask her questions and interact with her, definitely don't forget to register and tune in for that next Friday at 1 p.m. So thank you so much again, Ralph. This was so much fun. I learned a lot. I know everyone else did too. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. And for those of you, just look me up on LinkedIn, connect with me, stay connected. I'm happy to help any way I can. So thanks for having me and spending an hour with me.
Awesome. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.